أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وعظيمنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين المنتجبين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة وجاهدوا في سبيله لعلكم تفلحون. صدق الله العلي العظيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. السلام عليكم جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. We began our discussion last night talking about Nahjul Balagha, the peak of eloquence, a collection of the sermons, the lectures and the sayings of our first Imam, Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. And the focus of yesterday's discussion was about the history of Nahjul Balagha, some of the aspects of the contents of Nahjul Balagha and its compilation. But tonight we'll spend the majority of tonight discussing what is probably the most important question when it comes to analyzing this work. That is its authenticity. Because one of the questions that came up yesterday was about how we know that Nahjul Balagha is an authentic work or a reliable work, given the fact that there was a distance of 360 years or so, about 7 generations, between the compiler Sharif al-Radi and Imam Ali alayhi salam. And so we will dissect this in some depth. Now, the compiler, he was, as we looked at yesterday, he was the 12th descendant of Imam Ali alayhi salam. He was descendant of Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salam. And he compiled the work Nahjul Balagha around the year 400 after Hijrah. So this was a very formative period in the history of Shia Islam. It was just after 2 of the canonical Shia compilations of hadith. Within Sunni Islam, there are 6 Sahih Sitta, which are the 6 most important primary sources of hadith. And in the Shia school of thought, there are 4. And they are all based from the works and the books collected from the students of the 5th and the 6th Imams. It was around the time of the compilation of the first 2, Usul al-Kafi and Man la yahduruhu al-Faqih. They had both already been compiled, they'd already been prepared, and the other 2 afterwards, Al-Istibsar and Tahdhib al-Ahkam, would follow soon afterwards. So it was a very formative time in Shia Islam. And again, around this time, there were many of the great scholars, Shaykh al-Murtada, Shaykh al-Mufid, Shaykh al-Saduq, Shaykh al-Tusi, so on and so forth. So the first question to ask, before we even directly analyze the authenticity of the book, is whether it can be reliable. Because with this gap in time, how is it that we would have access to the sermons and the sayings and letters of the Imam in so much detail? And when we analyze the sermons, we do look at every single word, every letter, every inflection is of importance. So is it even possible to compile such a work at such a time? Well, the first thing to recognize is that the people of Arabia, they were people of memorization. They had learned long poems from before, they would memorize long chapters, and even after the coming of the Holy Prophet, they were people who memorized the Holy Quran in its entirety. And a hadith that were transmitted even from the Holy Prophet from before the time of the Khilafah of Imam Ali, which is where the majority of Nahjul Balagha comes from, people they had memorized and passed it down by oral tradition. So this is a general point. People can memorize and pass on from generation to generation, especially amongst the Arabs of Arabia. But specifically to the Imam, because with the Holy Prophet, they were Kutab al-Wahi, for example, they were people who would follow the Rasul around. That whenever a verse of the Quran would come down, there were a group of people who would write it immediately. There were a number of secretaries around the Imam, people who would, around the Holy Prophet, people who would record his every word. But a similar thing, not to the same extent, but a similar thing also happens specifically to the first Imam. His sermons were particularly memorized. Now, Al-Mas'udi, who's known as the Herodotus of the Arabs, one of the most famous historians of Islam, he writes in his Muruj al-Dhahab, and he, by the way, he passes away 13 years before the birth of Ash-Sharif al-Radi. So very, very similar time. And he says in his book, that which has been preserved of Ali's sermons that were delivered on various occasions, the number, it exceeds 480. And Ali used to deliver his sermons without any preparation, and people recorded his words and they would derive particular benefit from it. So this is one of those sources we can look at that show that Imam's sermons and his words were memorized. Why? Because people took active and deliberate benefit from them. And that's the reason behind the compilation of Nahjul Balagha as well. And remember, Sharif al-Radi, when he talks about the reason for compiling it, he says so that it opens the doors of eloquence. Eloquence being the ability to use the language in a beautiful way. So that's point number 2 about the possibility of compilation. The third point is that there were people who would record and write many of the documents or the words of Imam. For example, in the 96th year after Hijrah, there is a man called Zayd bin Wahab al-Juhayni. And he would write down many of the sermons, particularly the Jumu'ah and the Eid sermons of the Imam. And that's one of the main contributions that we have to Nahjul Balagha. In the Imam's lifetime, there were people like Abdullah ibn Abi Rafi', who would write down, he was a secretary, a scribe to the Imam, he would write down his documents. And remember, the Imam, he becomes Khalifa. And so many of his letters are written down, and many of them survived, enough for them to be transmitted on. So it is not unreasonable to know that his words were written down. Very similar to how the words, obviously not to the same extent, but similar to the words of the Holy Prophet. Because the first uncontroversially accepted book of hadith that was collected, not fully authentic, but the first that was collected, is Malik's Muwatta. And that was compiled about 150 years after the passing of the Holy Prophet. And Sahih al-Bukhari, it came about 50 years later. And so every answer to the question that we give to non-Muslims when they ask us, how can you have the sayings and the sermons of your Holy Prophet, despite the fact the writings took place so long afterwards, all of the answers to those questions, to a similar extent, slightly lesser extent, they apply to the first Imam. And remember, the recording of hadith, they were banned during the lifetime of after the lifetime of the Holy Prophet. And the excuse that the Khulafa they gave was they did not want a book to rival the Quran. And fourth, Imam Ali alayhi salam, one of the reasons why they wouldn't have been compiled earlier is because Imam, he was cursed from the minbars. The Banu Umayyah, it was instigated by Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, they used to abuse the Imam from the pulpit. And it's a well-known fact of history. There are multiple traditions. If you open Sahih Muslim and you look at the chapter of the virtues of Imam Ali, there are a few hadith which start off with people asking, why don't you curse Imam Ali? Now you don't ask that question about the greatest Sahabi of the Holy Prophet unless it is ubiquitous, it is normal to curse him. And many of the historians like Ibn Kathir and Al-Bidayah wal-Nihaya, Tabari in his Tarikh, they have recorded this event. So they were memorized, they were kept secret until the time that it was more open and they were able to publish. So this is about the possibility of the compilation of Nahjul Balagha. But this still doesn't say whether specifically the collections within this holy book are indeed authentic. And so we will look first, before we go into the positive evidences, we will look at the negative ones, the ones that people have accused Nahjul Balagha of being inauthentic. Now the first point to note is that for 250 years, nobody objected to the authenticity of Nahjul Balagha. And it was collected in a time when there was a lot of academic freedom. People would publish their works, their theories, and there would be rebuttals to those books and rebuttals to the rebuttals. Anybody could publish what they wanted. It wasn't a very repressive society at that time. 250 years, nobody objected. And there were many scholars, even from the school of Ahl Sunnah, who wrote comprehensive commentaries. Ibn al-Hadid, for example, he was a Shafi'i Mu'tazilite. He's written the most authoritative commentary to date, and he wrote it before anyone questioned its authenticity. Abul Hasan al-Bayhaqi, he also wrote a commentary on Nahjul Balagha, again before anyone questioned its authenticity. Until 250 years later, we arrive at the first man to question it. His name is Ibn Khalikan, and he was a 7th century biographer. And he writes in his chapter about Shaykh al-Murtada, because remember, Shaykh al-Murtada, the older brother of the compiler, al-Sharif al-Radi, he was the A'lam, the greatest Shia scholar of his time. So Ibn Khalikan, he writes in Wafayatul A'yan, disagreements have been found amongst people regarding Nahjul Balagha, that were the compiled sayings of Imam Ali, whether they were the sayings of Ali or the sayings of Sayyid al-Murtada who compiled it, and they say they are not the sayings of Ali, but they belong to the compiler. Allah knows best. So first, he expresses doubt. He doesn't know who the true compiler of the work is, whether it is Shaykh al-Murtada or al-Sharif al-Radi, number one. So there's a little bit of confusion there, and it's quite speculative what he's saying, low resolution. But number two is he says that it may have been written, it may have been fabricated by the author himself, al-Sharif al-Radi. Now, anybody who makes this claim in totality, that the whole thing is fabricated or may be fabricated, immediately we can take that objection and we can throw it away. And we can ignore it. Why? I'll answer that in a few moments, but hold on to that. Now, the author himself, Ibn Khalikan, his motives are also questionable. Now, when you analyze history, you look at people's motives when they're writing something or they're saying something, because it can inform what they're saying. And this man was a lover of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. In the same book, Wafayatul A'yan, he writes that in the year 633, when I was in Damascus, I memorized a whole collection of Yazid's poems because I was extremely fond of him. So much so that I was able to tell the true poems that he wrote versus the ones that were fabricated in his name. So this is how devoted he was to Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And the objections initially, they came not from Baghdad, which was the center of learning, but from Andalusia, from North Africa, places which were under Umayyad influence. So he is the first, Ibn Khalikan. The second most important person to directly object to the authenticity of Nahjul Balagha is Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi. And whenever we speak to any of our brothers in the school of Ahl Sunnah regarding the critique of hadith, al-Dhahabi's name comes up. He's one of the most respected in the school of Ahl Sunnah and one of the harshest. And he writes, he was a Shafi'i Muslim, he writes in his biography of Shaykh al-Murtada, again the older brother's biography, he says that al-Murtada, he was the compiler of Nahjul Balagha, which is attributed to Imam Ali. But there are reports contained therein which have no chains of narration. Now this point we'll come back to. Some of them are false, some of them are true, and there are some fabricated reports that the Imam would never have said. But who is the fair-minded man who would look at it objectively? It was said that it was compiled by his brother Ar-Radi, and it includes slander against the companions of Rasulullah. May Allah protect us from knowledge that is of no benefit. So there are a couple of points he makes here. The most important one is the absence of the chains of narration, and we'll hold on to that point, we'll come back to it shortly. But another point he makes, and what burns his blood when he's writing this, is the fact that in Nahjul Balagha there is some criticism of other companions, particularly of the first three Khulafa. If you open, for example, the sermon of Shaqshaqiyya, or you open some of the sermons about the battle of Jamal relating to Talha and Zubair, two of the other Sahaba, there are some critical things which are said. But to reject something simply because there is criticism of Sahaba is an unacademic approach. Now why is that? Now we all know there was an industry of fabrication of hadith, because after the Holy Prophet, we remember that hadith, they were not allowed to be compiled. Anybody who had written them down, their collections were gathered and they were burned. There's a well-known tradition, for example, the first Khalifa, he compiled some hadith himself, and then when the following day after he compiled it, he said that he was worried that it would be put next to the Quran, so he burned it. And hadith, they were only compiled later on, which is why the shortest chain of narration that you'll have in any hadith is 3. And even there are critics of hadith who say even 3 is too small. The minimum is 4. And there were many people who had an industry of fabricating hadith. They would fabricate hadith because they would get political gain. They would try and malign their enemies, for example, try to bring the reputation of their adversaries down. They would do it because they were bribed. Sometimes they were Israeliyat, people who came in from Christianity and Judaism, and they tried to import their beliefs in Islam. Whatever the motive behind, there were lots of different motives. The most pernicious of all, actually, which is quite interesting, were good Muslims who fabricated hadith. And they fabricated hadith because they thought, if I fabricate this hadith and someone does a good thing because of it, I have done a net good in the world. And for hadith scholars, these are some of the most difficult people to deal with, because otherwise they seem trustworthy. But that point aside, there are lots of fabrications. So how do we know what is a real hadith, what is not? We are immensely critical. You look at the chain of narration, person A said that person B said that person C said that Rasulullah said XYZ. Every person in the chain you critique. Person C, did he go to places he shouldn't have gone? Person B, was he close to the Khalifa who was an enemy of the Holy Prophet, for example? Was he someone who was known as the fabricator, person A? But the most important person in the chain is who? The Sahabi of the Prophet from whom the hadith originates. So how can you have a hadith science where you critique every single person in the chain without any mercy, and rightfully so? But when you come to the source, the first person in the chain, you say no. He's a Sahabi, we'll close our eyes, we'll accept anything they say. That's not an academic approach. And certainly the criticism of Sahaba in Nahjul Balagha, although emotionally that's why some people reject it, from an intellectual perspective, it's not a valid measure. So that's Shamsuddin al-Dhahabi. The next on the list of important objectors is a man called Ibn Taymiyyah. Now, for those who have heard his name in the school of Ahlul Bayt, you'll know that his relationship and his attachment to Ahlul Bayt leaves a lot to be desired. There's a lot of narrations, a lot of things that he writes, especially in his magnum opus, Minhaj as-Sunnah, where he says some things which are very questionable about Ahlul Bayt. So just to give one example, the verse of the Holy Quran that was revealed, Surah An-Nisa, verse 43, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, la taqrabu as-salata wa antum sukara, hatta ta'lamu ma taqulun. O believers in Allah, when you come to the prayers, do not come drunk, so that you don't mistake what you're saying, so that you actually know what you're reciting. And Ibn Taymiyyah, he says, وَالْعَيَاضُ بِاللَّهِ, he says this verse was revealed about Imam Ali salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. So he's quite harsh, and there's many statements he's made when it comes to hadith which are very questionable. But regarding Nahjul Balagha, what does he say? He says in Manhaj as-Sunnah an-Nabawiyya, most of the khutab that the author of Nahjul Balagha includes are lies against Ali. This is what Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, of course not me. Whoever says the words of Ali are duna kalam al-khaliq wa fawqa kalam al-makhluq, that is below the level of the creator but above the level of the creation, they are mistaken. Because Rasulullah is a creation, and are we saying that his words are below that of Imam Ali? That's number one. Number two, he says, the author of Nahjul Balagha and his ilk took many of the things that people said and they made them the words of Imam Ali. So he's saying that some of the sermons, Sharif al-Radi, he authored, and then he wrote Imam Ali's name next to them. He says if these sermons were really spoken by Imam Ali, they would have been found in other books before Sharif al-Radi, and they would have had chains of narration. It is known from those who are well versed in the study of narrations that many of them, indeed most of them, were unknown before this, and so it can be established that they are fabrications. So he makes a few important points here. The first point, which I find most ironic, is he takes issue with this eloquent statement, دُونَ كَلَامِ الْخَالِقِ وَفَوْقَ كَلَامِ الْمَخْلُوقِ. That is the statement of adoration that people say about the words of the Imam. That his words are below the level of the creator, above the level of the creation. Now, is this literal? Of course it's not a literal statement, right? Because Imam Ali is created, his words are created. Not for a moment is anyone saying that there exists some zone in between God and mankind. Mankind includes Rasulullah, God is above, and Imam Ali is somewhere in between. That's nonsensical. And he interprets it literally. Now there are lots of idioms in English, for example, in other languages. If you're pulling someone's leg, if you're biting the bullet, if you're running the gauntlet, if you're breaking a leg, whatever it is, if you take them literally, people would look at you as if you've gone insane. But of course it's not literal, because remember, what's the book called? Nahjul Balagha. the peak of eloquence. So Ibn Taymiyyah, in saying this, he has missed the entire point of what Nahjul Balagha is. But what is the sticking point? Because the important point that he makes is about the chains of narration. That there are none. And this is the same thing that Al-Dhahabi said before him. Now, what is his condition? He says that if it is authentic, if it is real and not made up by the author, the sermons transmitted in Nahjul Balagha would have been found in other books before Al-Sharif or Rabi. So how do we answer this? If Nahjul Balagha has no chains, Al-Sharif or Rabi did not provide them, does that mean the whole book is mursal? Does that mean the whole book has no connection to the Imam? That they were taken out of thin air? Of course not. As we said yesterday, Al-Sharif or Rabi, he compiles it for eloquence, right? But he takes it assiduously from the resources which were available to him at the time. And so, for almost every single thing in Nahjul Balagha, some of the sayings in particular we don't have corroboration, but for almost everything within Nahjul Balagha, there is a corresponding source in another book. And within the other books, you'll find the full chain of narration. So, the point that we made earlier about Ibn Khalikan, he says that the whole thing might be fabricated. Immediately you can throw that out. Why? Because it has been corroborated in books before Al-Sharif al-Radi was born. So how can he author something that was recorded in a book before he was born? And just to state some of the books, so we're aware, that contain, there are books from the scholars of the school of Ahlul Bayt who have assiduously collected chains of narration corroborating sources. Masadir Nahjul Balagha wa Asaniduh by Abdul Zahra Husseini al-Khatib. This is perhaps the most comprehensive one specific to Nahjul Balagha. Istinad Nahjul Balagha by Ali Khan Arshi. Mu'jam al-Mufahras li Alfad Nahjul Balagha by Sayyid Kadhim Muhammadi Sheikh Muhammad Dashti. These are three books which specifically gather the sermons, the lectures, the sayings of the Imam, and they give corroborations. Then there are other books relating to this. For example, Nahjul Sa'ada fi Mustadrak Nahjul Balagha by Muhammad Baqir al-Mahmudi. It is a 14-volume book collection whereby he collects all the sermons and lectures and sayings of the Imam that he can with chains of narration, and that includes many of them from Nahjul Balagha, and finally Tamam Nahjul Balagha by Sayyid Sadiq al-Musawi. And this is where he completes the sermons. Al-Sharif al-Radi, sometimes he takes parts of the sermons and he puts them in Nahjul Balagha. He takes the full sermon. So, and the corroboration that is found, it includes many sources from the school of Ahlul Bayt, but also many from the school of Ahl Sunnah as well. For example, At-Tarikh al-Tabari, there's Tarikh Ya'qubi, Baladuri, so on and so forth. So that's point number one. The most important objection that there are no chains of narration, the simple response is yes, there are. Number one. Number two, another positive evidence we can give for the authenticity of Nahjul Balagha is the reputation of the compiler. Now, Sharif al-Radi, he wasn't a nobody. He was a very notable character in society. His older brother was the greatest Shia scholar of his time, the A'la. They had very prominent posts both from a religious perspective and from a secular perspective. And it was in Baghdad, the academics' capital of the world. And as followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt, just because someone writes a book and puts an imam's name next to it doesn't mean we jump on them. We're not desperate for them because we have so many different sources. And there are other works which are attributed to the imams or to the Holy Prophet that we are very critical of. For example, there's a book called Kitab Sulaym ibn Qais. And this is a little controversial because some people accept it, but by and large, critics of hadith, they say that this is probably not authentic. Other books, for example, Diwan Ali, which is allegedly a collection of poems from Imam Ali. Imam didn't really write much poetry, so it is not thought to be that authentic. Fiqh al-Rida, Tafsir of Imam al-Askari, these are all works that have found Imam's names next to them, and they were probably written by someone else. And so, the scholars of hadith within the school of Ahlul Bayt, they are very rigorous. They look at some works, for example, Nahjul Balagha, they look at works like Ghurar al-Hikam, and they say, yes, these are reasonably reliable. But other books, which come from unknown sources or without corroboration, we have no hesitation in rejecting. So that's point number two, reputation of the compiler. Number three is historical interest. Again, many scholars from the school of Ahlul Bayt and from the school of Ahl Sunnah, they wrote commentaries on it. That includes scholars of old, like Ibn al-Hadid, Abu al-Hasan al-Bayhaqi, but also more contemporary scholars as well, like Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, who we'll speak about shortly. It was only after these commentaries that people began to question it because they were worried about the reputation of the Sahaba. Number 3. And number 4 is there is a uniqueness of the eloquence that runs through Nahjul Balagha. When an author writes a book, or they write a collection of books over the course of their lifetime, they develop a certain type of style. So think about it, if you pick up a copy of any of the plays of Shakespeare, you'll find there is some uniformity between them. And then if you come across a play that you didn't read before, you might think, oh, that's in the style of Shakespeare. And it may well be from the same author. And the same can be said of Nahjul Balagha. Ibn al-Hadith, the Shafi'i scholar, Mu'tazilite, he does exactly this. And he says, I went through Nahjul Balagha and I found that the style was completely consistent with the Imam. And people asked him, maybe it was Sharif al-Radi, maybe he wrote some, and he said that's rubbish. Because I know the poetry. Sharif al-Radi, he was a poet. He wrote a lot of works himself. And he says, I can immediately tell his style. And Sharif al-Radi, he writes some comments in Nahjul Balagha, and we know immediately which words belong to him and which words belong to the Imam. Allah. And regarding the uniqueness of style, in order to prove the authenticity of Nahjul Balagha, it is something which can be done using more objective techniques. Yes, there are subjective assessments by masters like Ibn al-Hadith, but there are also mathematical ones which are a bit more objective. There are lots of different ones which have developed, and one was used by some researchers, by Rahim Sarwar and Ahmad Muhammad at the University of Wolverhampton. And they looked particularly at the morphology. It's a complex study. It's available for those who are interested. And they looked at Nahjul Balagha, the Arabic therein. And they answered 2 questions. Number 1, the author of Nahjul Balagha, is it one person or is it disjointed? Can it be from other people who came together in putting this work? And number 2 is whether it is consistent with the styles of either Al-Sharif al-Radi or Sheikh al-Murtada. Those are the 2 to whom the fingers of accusation sometimes point. And they conclusively found that number 1, the author of Nahjul Balagha is one person. Whoever it is, it's beyond the scope of this discussion. Whoever it is, the author is one. And number 2, they are absolutely not either Al-Sharif al-Radi or Sheikh al-Murtada. Now, the majority of it is corroborated, but not all of it, particularly some of the sayings therein. But remember, the people at that time, they had a unique access to certain sources which we don't have today. For example, when the Mongols, when they sacked Baghdad in 1258, when Hulagu Khan, when he attacked Baghdad, he massacred everyone there. And it is said that the river, the Tigris River, it turned red with the blood of martyrs, of victims, and they threw so many books from that grand library, the treasure of knowledge of the planet, they threw it into the river. And so the river turned red with blood and black with ink. So how many of the sources they had at the time do we not have today? And so that's one of the reasons, by the way, that in hadith sciences, even if you have a weak hadith, a hadith which is da'if, you know someone in the chain of narration is not acceptable, or the chain is not complete, you might still be able to use that hadith, as long as it's not controversial, as long as it's not something which challenges basic doctrines. It's still quite useful. And one of the other ways we can say is that eloquence, that uniformity of the style. It's another sort of indirect evidence. So just a final few words on the authenticity before we move on. For Shi'as, in the school of Ahlul Bayt, Nahjul Balagha, it is an essential work. Allama Tabatabai, he famously said, for us as Shi'as, whoever wrote Nahjul Balagha was Imam Ali, even if the compiler was born 100 years ago. That's how much dedication. He's a philosopher. The philosophy in it is beautiful, philosopher and mystic. Reza Shah Kazemi, he notes that over the centuries, Shia scholars have assiduously rebutted charges of inauthenticity against Nahjul Balagha, and that a large portion of it can be reliably traced back to Imam Ali. So the majority of it can be traced back to the Imam. Now, it's important, especially when we look at authenticity, to be humble as well. Because there are parts of Nahjul Balagha which either have not been corroborated or are quite controversial, or might not be consistent with the Imam's morals or with the Imam's eloquence. Now, it's beyond the discussion for tonight or for the coming nights, but one of the main topics which has drawn some criticism is some of the sermons or some of the sayings and words in Nahjul Balagha regarding women. Sermon number 80, for example, in particular, there are some things which, even when people try to explain them, they look quite harsh. They don't look like they are words that belong to Imam Ali, the same Imam who treats his wife the way that he treats her. And so, for anyone who's interested, who wants to go more into detail in this topic, Sister Amina in Lois, she has written a document, quite an academic work, which looks into this exact question. It's available online for anyone who's interested. So for Shi'as, it is mostly authentic. Now for our brothers in the school of Ahl Sunnah, what can we say? Well, there are three main options. Number one is to accept it in the same way or a similar way to how we as Shi'as in the school of Ahlul Bayt accept it. Because there are many great Sunni scholars of old who have done so, to the extent that they wrote commentaries on it, including contemporary scholars like Sheikh Muhammad Abdu, and those who respect the consistency of its style. So that's option number one. Option number two is to say no. The critiques of people like Al-Dhahabi are very harsh. And so we look at it through a more critical lens. But remember, they have been corroborated. So each individual sermon, when you look at the corroboration, then you can make a judgment as to whether you accept it or whether you reject it. Even the harsher critics like Ibn Taymiyyah or Al-Dhahabi, they said that some of it is true, some of it is false. And so by looking at the chains of narration in the corroborations, then we can accept some of it, maybe reject others. For our brothers in the school of Ahl Sunnah, that's option number two. Option number three is to take a slightly unacademic approach and to say, well, I will read it as per intended by Ash-Sharif al-Radi, which is a book of eloquence. And in order to understand more about the language, and any parts that I don't like or that don't fit in with my doctrine, I'll ignore, and any parts that are consistent, I'll accept. And again, this kind of approach is not rejected in hadith sciences. There are da'if hadith, there are mursal hadith that can be accepted if it is not controversial. So that's the last word on authenticity. Now, what about the significance of the sermons of the Imam? What kind of an impact did his sermons have? Now, during his lifetime, soon afterwards, in the words of the scholars afterwards, the classic scholars, and in the more modern scholars, we can see three different groups of people who were profoundly impacted by his words. Now, in this section, we'll look at his words more generally, because many of the scholars here, they refer to his words before the compilation of Nahjul Balagha. But the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam, they had a profound impact. Because sometimes you have authors who write great works, but they're not appreciated until they pass away. But that's not the case for the Imam. And we'll look at a few examples. Sharif al-Radi, he writes, when the Imam gives the sermon of Al-Gharra, he gives one of the famous sermons from Nahjul Balagha, everybody around, their hearts melted, their tears soaked their beards, and the hearts of the listeners, they quivered with emotion. There is one sermon in particular where one of the companions of the Imam, when he hears the description of the muttaqeen, according to one tradition, at the end of it, in a fever of excitement, he passes away. So it has impact on people around him. Az-Zubayr ibn Awwam, he was one of the companions of the Holy Prophet, and he originally was one of the lovers of Imam Ali. According to the traditions in Tarikh al-Tabari, which look in a little bit of detail about those who went to the house of Lady Fatima, alayha salam, in order to get the allegiance of the Imam, one of the people inside the house on the side of Imam Ali was Zubayr. And in Tabari it mentions he came out to fight and he fell over his sword, he was taken as a captive. So he was very close to the Imam initially, but over time he drifted away. And when the Imam became Khalifa, he was one of those who originally gave allegiance to the Imam, but then he backtracked on it. And he was responsible in part, alongside Talha, another companion, and Lady Aisha, one of the wives of the Prophet, in raising an army against the Imam in what became known as the Battle of Jamal, the Battle of the Camel. The Imam sent him many letters, the Imam spoke to him, the Imam gave him many sermons, wise sayings, and eventually they seem to have had an impact. Because there are lots of narrations which say, Ibn al-Hadith, for example, he has one, and there are other sources as well, which say that on the battlefield, when he heard the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam, he became so disturbed. He became so disconnected from his initial motivations to fight the Imam that he actually left. He didn't fight in the battle which he was responsible for instigating. Some say he fought temporarily so that he wouldn't be called a coward. And there's a little bit of murkiness around exactly what happened. But at the very least, we can say the words of the Imam were enough to cause some doubt and trepidation in the heart of an enemy who was raising an army against him. So that's another impact of his words. Another battle that the Imam fought in his lifetime was known as the Battle of Nahrawan. Now this battle was against the Kharijites. Kharijites, They were people who said, we have no leader except Allah. They were born out of a group of extremists from the army of the Imam. During the Battle of Siffin, when the Imam had almost defeated Muawiyah ibn Abu Sufyan, Malik al-Ashtar was very close to vanquishing him, his own army, Imam's army, turned against him. They saw that Muawiyah had put Quran on spears. They fell for a very astute propaganda move. Imam said, no, we have to finish the battle here. They insisted, Imam relented, and then Muawiyah tricked everyone. So they became very resentful against all leaders, against the Imam, against Muawiyah, so on and so forth. And they started to spread this ideology, no ruler except Allah. And they were a very vicious people. Very, very terrible things they did. 12,000 people gathered to fight Imam Ali. When they heard the eloquent words of the Imam and the aphorisms that he gave to his companions when they went and they spoke amongst the people, around 8,000 of them left. About 75% of the army dissolved, leaving only 4,000 behind. How many lives did the Imam save on that day just with his words? How many souls did he save on that day just with his words? Another example is Ibn Abbas, one of the companions, one of the very celebrated, respected companions of the Holy Prophet. And he says that I did not derive any benefit from anyone after the words of Rasulullah, after the Quran, then I would benefit from the utterances of Ali ibn Abi Talib. Another example was during this time of civil war with Muawiyah. There were a number of people who would leave the Imam's side and they would go over to Muawiyah's side. And there'll be, inshallah, in the coming nights, we'll devote one particular night to the relations between Imam Ali and Muawiyah. And one person who changed sides was a man called Muhqin ibn Abi Muhqin. And when he went over to Muawiyah's side, he wanted to flatter him. He knew that he was an enemy of the Imam. And he thought, a way that I can get some position is by abasing the Imam. And so he said, "O Amir Muawiyah, I have joined you after coming from the side who is led by the most illiterate of Arabs." SubhanAllah, when you flatter someone, right, you at least make it believable. Muawiyah was so incensed by this. He found this statement so ridiculous, the enemy of Imam Ali. And he says, this is nonsense. How could you say this about Ali ibn Abi Talib? Woe unto you. Do you really call Ali the most illiterate of men? For surely Quraysh knew nothing about Balagha before him. It was Ali that taught the Arabs Balagha. Ibn al-Hadid, he records this in his Sharh of Nahjul Balagha. So the Imam's words, they had a profound impact during his lifetime. And they also had an impact on scholars of old. For example, Ibn al-Hadid, who I've mentioned repeatedly now and again, he is the most authoritative commentator on Nahjul Balagha. He says that Imam was the leader of the eloquent ones, the master of the rhetors. About his speech they say, دون كلام الخالق وفوق كلام المخلوق. Below the words of the Creator, above the words of the creation. It was a well-known saying at his time. And of course it influenced him enough to write such a large commentary. Another one who was affected by the words of Imam Ali, and perhaps the most impressive of all, was a man known as Al-Jahid. Now for those familiar with Islamic literature, Al-Jahid, he was a giant. Of Ibn Khaldun, he says that there are 4 main works of classic Arabic literature. And one of the 4 is by Al-Jahid, which is known as Al-Bayan wa Tabyin. And he, quite ironically, it's probably apocryphal, there's no real source for it, but it is said that he was so engrossed in learning, and he had so many books in his private library that one day when he was studying, the library collapsed upon him, and that's how he died. It's a popular saying, but it's probably not true, but it just tells us about how academic this man was. And he says, he gathers about 100 sayings of Imam Ali, and he says in the same work, Bayan wa Tabyin, every one of these sayings of Ali ibn Abi Talib is equivalent to 1,000 of the most beautiful Arabic sayings. And he then quotes the Imam, one of his favorite lines from the Imam. He says, Imam Ali, قِيمَةُ كُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا يُحْسِنُ. The value of a man lies in what he has mastered. Just one short aphorism of the Imam. Al-Jahid, he can't stop praising this line of the Imam. The next half a page he devotes to praising this sentence. And he says that if this book of mine, this classic of Arabic literature, contained nothing except these words of Imam Ali, that would be sufficient. The best of speech is that which is little in volume, you dispense with much of it, and the meanings are not concealed, and the words, they stand out. He says, it appears as if Allah Almighty has enveloped His glory and covered it with the light of wisdom proportionate to the piety and the taqwa of the speaker, Imam Ali. And in the same work, when he's talking about another one of the orators of Quraysh, of Arabia, a man by the name of Sa'sa' bin Suhan, he says, the greatest proof that this man was an eloquent orator is that from time to time he was asked to give a sermon by who? By Ali ibn Abi Talib, by the master of eloquence. So he is Al-Jahid, he's infatuated with Imam Ali. Another of the classic scholars is a man called Abdul Rahman ibn Nubata. He was one of the foremost poets of the 14th century, and he said that I memorized treasures of speeches from Imam Ali. And then whenever I use them, they don't decrease, instead they increase. And I memorized 100 chapters of his works. Another is a man called Abdul Hamid Katib. Now he was a master of Arabic prose. He was the last scribe to the last of the Umayyad Khulafa within the Middle East. And he says, I learned by heart 70 sermons of Ali ibn Abi Talib, after which my mind overflowed with inspiration. So where did he get his eloquence from? By memorizing the lines of Imam Ali. But the interesting thing is, remember, he's the scribe for who? For the Umayyads. Umayyads are not allowed to like Imam Ali. So when he's asked about him, he can't hold back his indebtedness to him. But he says that what is it that gave me eloquence? He says, I memorized the discourses of the bold one. Using a bit of Umayyad propaganda, an insult against Imam Ali, which wasn't true, but it was the only way he could praise the Imam, if with one hand, if he insulted him with the other. So even those who opposed the Imam, they couldn't escape his eloquence. So that's during the time of the scholars of old, but also during contemporary times as well. Again, those who are familiar with the modern history of Islam would have heard the name of Sheikh Muhammad Abdu. He was the Grand Mufti of Egypt. Of course, he's from the school of Ahl Sunnah. Grand Mufti of Egypt. He was a judge, a very famous pan-Arabist, pan-Islamist. And he happened across Nahjul Balagha. He fell in love with it. He loved it so much that he wrote a brief commentary on it as well. And he says, among all those who speak the Arabic language, there is not one man who does not believe Ali ibn Abi Talib, after the Quran and Hadith of the Prophet, that those words are the most noble, most eloquent, most profound, and most comprehensive. Dr. Taha Hussein, who was the famous Egyptian writer, he writes in one of his books, Ali wa Banu, about the story of a man who was confused at the Battle of Jamal. Now, the Battle of Jamal was a time of particular confusion amongst some of the Muslims there, because on the one side there was Imam Ali alayhi salam, Imam Hassan alayhi salam, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, there was Ammar ibn Yasir, about whom the Holy Prophet had said, no one will kill you except a baghi, except a rebel. So that's on one side. And on the other side, there were prominent companions of the Imam. There was Zubair, a devotee of the Holy Prophet. There was Talha, who according to some narrations, he might have been one of those who remained at the Mount of Uhud. And there was the wife of the Holy Prophet, Lady Aisha. So some people were confused. And one such man came to Imam Ali at the Battle of Jamal. And he said, Ya Ali, I don't understand that you are on one side, and on the other side there is Talha Zubair. How do I know where truth is? And Imam Ali gave a beautiful response. He said that you have mistaken and reversed the measure. Truth and falsehood are not measured by the worth of individuals, but rather first you find out what is true and false, and then you will see who stands with truth and who stands with falsehood. In other words, the best way to know the truth is not to see the person first, truth second, but see the truth first and then person second. Now, Dr. Taha Hussein, he loves this so much. He goes on to reword it, he describes it in a lot of detail, and then he says, next to the revealed word of God, I have never seen a more glorious and admirably expressed view than this reply of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And of course, as the final example from the school of Ahlul Bayt, there is Ayatollah al-Mutahhari. And he writes in his Glimpses of Nahjul Balagha, which is one of the main works that I've used over these nights, he says, since the earliest times, two distinct merits have been recognized through Ali's discourses. The first is fasaha and balagha, elegance and eloquence, and the second is the multi-dimensional nature of Nahjul Balagha, the fact that it covers so many disparate topics. And any one of them would have made it wonderful alone, but the combination of both simultaneously makes it almost miraculous. And hence he earns the aphorism or the saying that the words of Imam Ali are duna kalam al-khaliq wa fawqa kalam al-makhluq. But if these words of great scholars, of companions of the Holy Prophet, if they're not enough to convince you, one of the beautiful things about Nahjul Balagha is we probably have it on a shelf at home. And if not, it's available online. It's available everywhere because it is such a seminal book. So we can open it up and we can read it ourselves. And we can bask in the glory of Imam's mastery of Arabic and of religion. We'll take a couple of examples, inshallah, before concluding. In sermon number 229, and there'll be, of course, lots of quotes over the coming nights, Imam says, فَإِنَّ الْمَوْتَ هَادِمُ لَذَّاتِكُمْ وَمُكَدِّرُ شَهَوَاتِكُمْ ومباعد طياتكم زائر غير محبوب وقرن غير مغلوب وواتر غير مطلوب قد أعلقتكم حبائله وتكنفتكم غوائله وأقصدتكم معابله وعظمت فيكم سطوته وتتابعت عليكم عدوته وقلت عنكم نبوته. He's describing death. He says death will end your enjoyments, mar your pleasures, remove your objectives. It is an unwanted visitor, an invincible adversary, an unaccountable killer. Its ropes have ensnared you, its evil surrounded you, its arrowheads pointed at you, its sway over you great, its oppression continuous, and the chances of missing you remote. Just a small description of death. The personification and the balagha here is beautiful. In another saying number 8 of Nahjul Balagha, أعجب لهذا الإنسان ينظر بشحم ويتكلم بلحم ويسمع بعظم ويتنفس بخرب. That I marvel how wonderful man is. He sees with fat, he speaks with flesh, he hears with bones, and he breathes through a hole. When he's describing the nature of mankind, it's beautiful. And before anyone responds, of course, the eye is mostly made of protein, not fat, but the term which he uses refers to something which is soft, which can be greasy, which is like the eye. And remember, it is balagha. In saying number 126 of Nahjul Balagha, he says, I wonder at the miser who spends his life in this world as a poor person, but in the next world he is judged as a rich person. I wonder at the proud man who yesterday was a drop and tomorrow is a corpse. I wonder at the man who doubts Allah but sees his creation. I wonder at the one who has forgotten death but sees others dying. I wonder at him who denies the second life though he has seen the first life, the one who inhabits the transient abode but forgets the permanent one. Allah. Why has Nahjul Balagha had such an impact on companions, on great scholars, on us when we read it? Of course, because they are the words of Ali ibn Abi Talib. They are the words of the man about whom the Holy Prophet said, أَنَا مَدِينَةُ الْعِلْمِ وَعَلِيٌّ بَابُهَا. I am the city of knowledge, Ali is its gate. And in Tarikh Baghdadi, there's a further statement similar to this. I am the city of wisdom, Ali is its door. So whoever aspires to get wisdom must go through Ali. And Imam, he makes reference to this in Sermon 5 of Nahjul Balagha. He says, I have hidden knowledge, that if I disclose it, you will tremble like ropes in the deep wells. And Imam Ali alayhi salam, in his life, he was a master of the language. There were some companions who were discussing about the Arabic language, and they were saying, well, what is the most commonly used letter in Arabic? So one of them suggested it's probably the letter Alif. It will be very difficult to recite anything without this letter. Somewhat similar to the vowel A in English. Imam Ali alayhi salam, he hears them. This is recorded in Al-Manaqib by Ibn Shahrashub. He stands up, he gives a sermon without preparation, without the letter Alif. He then comes back to the people. They're confused. We thought that was supposed to be difficult. So they thought their conclusion must be wrong. It's not the letter alif, rather it must be any of the letters in Arabic that use dots. So Imam Ali alayhi salam, he said no problem. He stood up and he gave another sermon, quite a lengthy sermon, both of which are available now, and they were without dots. And he left them in a marvel. And that was the mastery that Imam Ali had. That it harks back to his great personality. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He invokes us in the Quran again, the verse I recited at the beginning, Surah Al-Ma'idah verse 35, O you who have believed, fear Allah and seek a wasila, a means to Him, and strive in His cause that you may succeed. And after the Quran, after the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet, the words of Imam Ali alayhi salam are unrivaled. So in summary, Nahjul Balagha, it is a unique work that represents the key to the gate of the city of knowledge. It is reasonably reliable, reasonably authentic, profoundly instructive, multivaried in its subjects, admired by scholars of old and scholars of new, and it truly goes down as one of the great works of the Islamic literary tradition.